I just finished building this simple and clean standing desk as part of my office makeover. Over time, I'll be building a credenza and some new shelving to go with it, but first, we'll take a look at how I transformed this rough slab of black walnut into this beautiful piece of art. We'll take a look at the build process from start to finish, some mid-project design changes, and even some moments that could have ruined the whole project. So let's go back and see where it all started. My dad gave me about half a walnut tree that he and his friend had milled up a few years ago, and I brought it home and stacked and stickered it on top of the office and left it there to finish air drying. One particular piece was about 3 inches thick and almost 14 inches wide in some spots, and I had a pretty good idea of what I wanted to build with that. And of course, that piece was on the very bottom of the pile, and it's heavy. Like, really heavy. Once I finally got it down and over to the workbench, I checked the moisture level in it just to be sure that it was ready to go, and it was all right around 6%, so we should be good to go. With that confirmed, I took some measurements to make sure it would actually work for the desk that I'm building, and I cut it in half. Now, since it was thicker than any of my circular saws can cut, I went with the most accurate saw I have in the shop, the good old Sawzall. Well, technically the Tiger saw, but you know, Kleenex, tissue, same thing. With the slab cut into 2 pieces, I spent some time flipping and flopping the pieces around, taking measurements, and just generally staring at it intently, trying to figure out what was going to be the best look for it. Finally, I decided to make a pattern to help me picture the final table size, and maybe that'll make the decision a little bit easier. Alright. I think I've pretty much got my layout where I want it, and now I just need to figure out, these are about 3 inches thick and I need them to be about 2 inches thick. So I'm going to try to rip one side off and get them down to a width that I can actually resaw on the bandsaw. I can only get about 12 inches through the bandsaw, and that's going to be making it work. So I think I can get the track saw out and try to square up one edge on each one and run it through, see how it goes. I made a couple of passes with the track saw to get it as deep as it could go, and then I used the bandsaw to finish the cutoff. Then I cleaned up the last little bit with the hand plane, and then I slowly fed it through the bandsaw. Alright, the resawing actually worked out pretty well. The side that came off the bandsaw is actually pretty flat, so I'm just going to go ahead and run it through the planer and try to get everything down somewhat close to the same thickness. That way I'm not, once I get it in the mold, I don't want to waste a lot of epoxy trying to fill in space that I don't need to. So I'll run through here and get them relatively flat, and then move on to building a mold. Got everything pretty well flat, and just need to take it outside and clean the edges off. So I'm gonna set up the sawhorses outside and get things cleaned up. I used a combination of these nylon abrasive wheels and a painter's tool to scrape and abrade the loose bark off. I'll leave a link in the description for these and any other special tools that I might use throughout the video. They do a pretty good job of getting the loose stuff off without digging in too much, but I did find that a lot of the sapwood was really soft and I was tearing into it really bad, so I finally had to make a decision. After slicing off quite a bit of the edge with what's actually a pretty dull painter's tool, I decided to just cut a lot of the sapwood off of the edge and make the gap in the middle bigger. In the end, that's actually a good thing because I was trying to be a little too conservative in my original design and probably would have been considered more of a creek table than a river table, I guess. Once that was cut down a little more, I finished picking out all the soft wood from the knots and the bark inclusions, and then I moved on to getting the mold built. I've seen people using melamine, and then I've seen people also wrapping that melamine in tuck tape or Tyvek tape, and I decided it was just a little redundant, so I'm just going to go with the melamine and spray it down with mold release. Hopefully that choice doesn't come back to bite me later. With the base all cut to size, I ripped some pieces down to about 3 inches tall and and I cut those down to size for the sidewalls. Alright, I got everything cut out now. I'm just going to put some sealant on it and put the sides together with clamps and put some screws in from the bottom just to hold it together and make it a little bit easier to take apart so I don't have to fight with any nails or anything like that. So I'm going to seal it up with just some Alex Plus basic window caulk, and we'll put some under the sides, and then we'll come back when we're all done and seal up the inside and the outside just to make sure we don't have any leaks. I pre-drilled all the holes to keep the melamine from splitting out, and I just ran some 1¼ inch screws in, probably about a foot apart. The caulk will work as an adhesive, and the screws are just there to hold it while it dries, but I also wanted to make sure I had enough screws in there so that I definitely don't have any weak spots, because we really don't want hundreds of dollars worth of epoxy running onto the floor either. Let that sit for a day or two and seal up and start getting ready to pour. With caulk drying in the mold, I cut the parts down to their final length and width so they'd fit nice and tight in the mold, and moved on to sealing up the slabs. For that, I'm going to use the same Total Boat Fathom thick set epoxy that we're using on the main pour, just without the black dye. There's two reasons to seal the slabs up prior to the pour. One, I want to seal it up so the black epoxy doesn't stain the wood, especially the lighter sapwood around the edges. And two, if the wood is sealed prior to the pour, theoretically, air can escape from inside the wood and cause extra bubbles in the epoxy while it's all setting up. I'm just using a foam roller and a cheap chip brush to work it into the grain and get down inside the knots and all the holes in the slabs. Once I have both sides covered, I'll let it sit overnight, and that should still be nice and tacky in the morning when I do the final pour, which will give us a good chemical bond between the two. In the morning, I made sure the mold was as level as I could get it, and then I sprayed it down with a good coating of mold release spray, loaded up the slabs, and got ready to mix up the epoxy. The seal coat had definitely stayed tacky like I wanted it to, but I had to be careful not to leave part of my gloves behind. I added a block wrapped in tuck tape to each end and clamped the slabs into the mold so they wouldn't float when I poured the epoxy in. These should just pop off when I pull it out of the mold. After all the prep was done, it's finally time to pour the epoxy, and this one's a simple 2-to-1 mixture, so the math's pretty easy on that. I mixed a full gallon of resin with a ½ gallon of hardener and used these cups to measure it all out. Once I had the epoxy itself mixed up to a uniform color, I added the black alcohol dye and continued mixing that for several more minutes with the paddle mixer on the drill. I made sure to scrape the sides with a stick and spin the bucket as I did so I wouldn't leave any unmixed sections. I don't want to wait 3 weeks and find out I have soft spots. Once I was absolutely sure I had a good mix, it was finally time to pour it into the mold and cross our fingers that there weren't any leaks. I did have a backup plan for that, but I really didn't want to find out if it actually works. Once I had the main river poured, I filled in all the holes and knots and made sure it got into the outside edges, and then I came back with this chip brush and just brushed down the inside edges to break off any air bubbles that might be clinging to the sides. Finally, I hit it with a torch to pop the bubbles as they came up and left it overnight with a small fan blowing over it to help keep the heat from building up and causing it to flash cure. So we made it through the first night, and I don't see any cracks, nothing crazy happened. Check the temperature on it, but I'm pretty sure everything's good where it should be. Got a couple of low spots. This one spot back here that I kept having to filled that 4 or 5 times yesterday. Overall, it looks pretty good. Now we just wait. Give it 2 or 3 weeks to cure, and we'll get back on building this table. With the epoxy fully cured and a couple of other projects finished up, I can finally get back to working on this build, and now we'll see what we really have to work with and just how hard it's going to be to get this mold off. The sides came off pretty much as expected with just a little persuasion from a dead blow hammer, and the tuck tape did its job on the clamping blocks. The bottom, well, that was going to take a bit more work. Looks like the tuck tape works. Not so sure about the mold release yet. I tried wedging the nail bar and the painter's tool in between the mold and the table to break it loose, and chased it around the sawhorses for a while with just the edges breaking off. I flipped it over and gave it a good massage with a dead blow hammer and tried to break it loose from the middle, and finally, when I was starting to think I might be machining all the melamine off of it, I got it to pop loose. Woohoo! Finally! Alright, the next thing we need to do is get this flattened out, and of course, the best way, my preferred way, would be to put it in the CNC and just let it run, but unfortunately my CNC is about 1/4 of the size of what I actually need. So we have a couple of different options. First one would be, I can pack it up in the truck, take it out to another shop that has a bigger CNC or a large wide belt sander that we could run it through. Unfortunately for this one, it is my project and I just don't have it in the budget to pay somebody else to do this. So we have to move on to another option. All right, so the final option, one that I'm gonna go with, is to build a router sled. And there's a couple different ways we could do that too. I actually ran a poll on YouTube here, and almost 100% of us, including myself, wanted to see the more complicated linear bearing roller style, basically a CNC without the computer controls. And yeah, I checked my wallet and it said no. We're gonna build a basic plywood sled with, I'm gonna use some leftover melamine from the mold to make the runner for the router to slide on, so it moves a little smoother. And we're just gonna use my 1 1/4 horse trim router with a smaller 1.5" bit. Take our time and probably spend all afternoon doing this, but we'll get her flat. If you missed the full video on the flattening sled build, I'll leave a link in the description so you can go back and see how that all went together. If I start building more large tables like this one, I'll probably upgrade to something a little nicer, but for now, it gets the job done for about 50 bucks, and other than a new flattening bit, I got to use all the tools I already own without any issues. So I've kind of been worried about this all along, but wasn't really sure what it was going to be, how it was going to work out until I started getting this flat yesterday. And what I'm finding is where it shrunk up in the middle, or some people said it's run underneath, which a lot of it did, but this didn't actually disappear until after about 2 days. It was overnight on the second night, so the only thing I can figure is it actually shrunk, because by then it was already too thick to run underneath. But either way, it is what it is. Now I've got everything flattened out quite a bit, and got like a quarter inch deep river down the middle. So it's got a lip on each end. I think I'm just going to use that, get it leveled up, and sand everything, and I'll pour another coat on top. Let that cure for a few days, and then we'll come back and finish flattening and get into sanding. So I scuffed up the epoxy with a red Scotch-Brite just to give it some bite, and I found I had just enough quickset epoxy to fill all this in. I mixed that up, poured it in, leveled it off, and let it set for the weekend to cure. I'm kind of kicking myself right now for not just overfilling everything in the first pour, because I had a couple inches left in the bucket that I could have used, but like anything in life, you can't go back, so you just have to pivot, find a way to make it work, and go with what you have. On Monday, I came back and finished the flattening process with the router, and honestly, it turned out pretty good for such a basic setup like this. Alright. Still not 100% down where I want to be, but I think at this point I'm going to take it and run it through the drum sander. I can flip it around and run it through two passes and get a full width. A few places here that don't look perfect, but I think at this point it's going to be the fast way to do it. I'll just put some 80 grit paper in there and we'll flatten both sides out. Then we'll go ahead and cut this thing up into shape and get it squared up. Start working on putting legs on it. One of the bad things about filming in the shop is that you really have your head in two different projects at once. You have to be thinking about the project you're building, but at the same time, you're thinking about getting the right shots and getting the cameras set up, and are they on, are the mics on, and all that fun stuff. Sometimes that gets to be too much, and as you see here, I forgot to turn the dust collector on, when I turned around and realized that the remote wasn't there where it should be, and I decided I should just let it go for this pass. And then, unfortunately, after that pass, I was in a big hurry, and, well, things happened. Luckily, it just dinged up the corners that I'll be cutting off and shaping later, so no harm, no foul, but yeah, that could have been much worse. I guess on the bright side, I know the epoxy got a good bond to the wood. Now I need to make a decision, because this is the bottom. Or was the bottom. I think I like it better than what I was gonna make the top, so. And I'll get it cut down to size. Do a little touch up here and there, and then see which one looks better then. For years I looked at the track saws, and like a lot of us, I said, why would I buy that when I have a circular saw and a straight edge? I finally decided to drink the Kool-Aid a little over a year ago, and after the first few cuts I was saying, why didn't I get one of these years ago? The accuracy, the simple setup, and the dust collection are so much nicer to use, and if you're on the fence about it, especially if you do a lot of sheet goods, just do it. You won't regret it. Alright, before we get any further, let's take a look at instructions. 2 or more individuals need to collaborate. It says right there. I don't see anybody else here. Let's get all the pieces out of the box and see what we have. Try to get things laid out. But I will read these, honest. The desk frame and lifting mechanism I went with is the FlexiSpot E6. And again, it's not a sponsored video, though I was in talks with them for a little while, and unfortunately our timelines just didn't work out. They wanted a desk built and a video produced in about 2 weeks because they were having a sale, and well, I wanted a nice desk that was going to take a couple months to build, so they just stopped talking to me after a while. I ended up just waiting for the sale and bought it myself on Amazon, so I'll leave a link to that in the description, and if you want to pick one up for your own project, it is actually a pretty nice base. Once I had all the parts laid out in the right direction, after checking the instructions, I got it all bolted together and set it on the floor, plugged it in. Just wanted to give it a test run to make sure everything was going to work before I drilled 16 large holes in the bottom of the tabletop. That'll work. Once I was sure it all worked, I set it back up on the table and got everything centered up, and then I went on a scavenger hunt to find the threaded inserts, since my drill bit I needed was actually with them, wherever they may be. Ha! Of course. Always keep your 1/4-20 threaded inserts in your rag drawer, because where else would you put them? I really gotta get this place organized. Alright, so the table frame mounting kit actually came with all these little screws to put in, and I'm going to swap those out. We're going to use some 1/4-20 threaded inserts and then put some button head cap screws in there. Drill all these out and get these inserted. And it's about time to start sanding. I do need to build a keyboard tray, so don't forget that, because I will. I used a self-centering bit to lay out all of my pilot holes, and then I went back with the larger bit and a depth stop to drill them all to the final size. I left the inserts out for now so they won't get full of sawdust and wax from the sanding and finishing process. Now before I forget to build it, I went back to the pile of walnut on top of the office, which of course I had completely restacked nicely with some cherry on top, and I found another board that worked well for the keyboard tray. I cut it down to the rough length, straightened it out on the bandsaw, squared that up on the joiner, and then I finally ripped it all down to size on the table saw. Once that was done, I glued it up and clamped it in the panel clamps to dry overnight. While the glue was drying on the keyboard tray, I went back over to the tabletop and filled in all the little pinholes and pockets that the epoxy hadn't quite filled in with some black CA glue. Then I just scraped that off with a razor blade so it was flat. The finish I'm using says to only sand up to 120 grit, but I just don't feel like that's enough, so I started at 80 and then went to 120 and finally finished it off with 180 grit. Once I had it done up to 180, I raised the grain with some water and I ran a chamfer all around the edges with the router. Didn't really like the look of the chamfer after I'd done it. It was a little too harsh, so I ended up just rounding that over with sander for a little nicer edge, and then finished everything up with another round of 180 grit. The next day I pulled the keyboard tray out of the clamps and ran it through the sander to get it flat. Once that was done, I cut it all down to size, finished sanding that, and prepped everything for finish. For the finish, I'm going with Natural One Coat again. I really like the finish that it's given me on the last couple projects, and it's pretty easy to apply and fix if I ever needed to. A little bit goes a long way, so I just mixed up a really small amount in this little silicone measuring cup and poured it on top. Used this Bondo spreader to get it spread all over the top, and then I decided to try a 6-inch buffer with a white finishing pad to spread it around and work it into the wood. Worked pretty well, but since the base is just foam, the pad actually stopped spinning once it was saturated and got a little too sticky. So I just finished the rest by hand and wiped off the excess with a shop towel once it had dried a few minutes. I let that sit overnight to cure, and in the morning I hit it all with a gray finishing pad just to smooth it out a little bit. I don't know if you could see it earlier, but once the finish went on the epoxy, it actually looked pretty bad, and there were sanding marks that I couldn't have seen before. To get it smooth and back to a nice matte finish, I just used a different buffer with a red and then onto a gray Scotch-Brite pad, which worked out perfectly. I just took a little patience to do it slowly and get a nice even finish on everything. I finished it all off with a coat of dark Minwax hard wax for just a little more protection. That probably wasn't necessary, but after buffing it all out, I thought it needed a little something to bring the sheen back to the wood. Once I had the finish done, I installed all the inserts and bolted the top to the base. I screwed the keyboard tray slider to the tray and mounted that to the desk and installed the control panel for the lifting mechanism. Once I was sure everything was going to work, I disassembled it all and took it into the office for final assembly and setup. This old desk is actually the first desk I ever built back in 2002 or 3. And as you can see, it's basically become a catch-all just like the rest of my office, which can be pretty distracting when I'm trying to work. For now, I'm just going to push the old desk back against the wall and keep it for storage, but in the end, I plan on building a new credenza, and I'm going to replace the old shelving on the wall with some new ones to match everything. So here it is in its new home, and now that I've used it for a few days, I absolutely love it. It's been a learning experience as always, but I'm really happy with how it turned out. I took a big, heavy slab of wood and turned it into a work of art that I'll enjoy using for years to come. So that's it for this build, so as always, thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next one.